The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the hardened lava fields of southern Idaho as Jacob Patterson steered his rented SUV along the dusty service road skirting the eastern boundary of Craters of the Moon National Monument. At 34 years old, the Denver-based software engineer had spent the better part of 2 years behind screens, watching his health deteriorate and his relationships fade into digital conversations. This trip was supposed to be different, a solo photography expedition through the volcanic wilderness, a chance to reconnect with the raw beauty of the American West that his grandfather had loved so deeply before passing away the previous winter. The old man had left Jacob his vintage Nikon camera and a handwritten journal filled with notes about capturing landscapes in their purest, most honest form. Before we continue with Jacob's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything. Jacob had studied the maps carefully, or so he thought. The Craters of the Moon wilderness stretched across 43,000 acres of twisted basalt, cinder cones, and sagebrush-dotted plains that resembled something from another planet. NASA had trained Apollo astronauts here decades earlier, preparing them for lunar landscapes they'd never actually walk upon. He parked at an unmarked pullout near the wilderness boundary, shouldered his backpack containing 3 days' worth of supplies, and set off into the black rock maze with his grandfather's camera and a GPS unit that showed a promising route to a remote cinder cone he'd spotted on satellite imagery. The feature appeared unique, untouched, the kind of dramatic geological formation his grandfather would have hiked miles to photograph. The terrain proved far more challenging than he'd anticipated from the comfort of his apartment planning sessions. What looked like smooth volcanic rock from a distance revealed itself as razor-sharp eye lava, rough, jagged formations that tore at his boots and forced him to move at an agonizing crawl. The basalt had cooled in twisted, chaotic patterns when ancient eruptions sent molten rock flowing across this landscape 15,000 years ago. Now those flows created a maze of knife-edged ridges, hidden depressions, and unstable surfaces that shifted unexpectedly underfoot. By late afternoon, he'd covered less than 2 miles according to his GPS, though his body felt like he'd climbed a mountain. The heat radiating from the black basalt was oppressive, easily exceeding 150 degrees, where the rock absorbed the relentless sun like a massive heat sink. Jacob drained his first water bottle faster than planned, reassuring himself that he'd find the small spring marked on his topographic map before nightfall. But the spring wasn't where the map indicated. Either the cartography was outdated, or he'd miscalculated his position in the featureless volcanic landscape, where every ridge and crater looked identical. As dusk approached, Jacob climbed to higher ground, hoping to spot his vehicle or any landmark he recognized. Instead, he saw only an endless expanse of volcanic desolation stretching toward the horizon, wave after frozen wave of ancient lava flows, punctuated by dark cones that all looked identical in the fading light. His GPS unit, which had been glitching intermittently all day with weak satellite signals, finally died completely, its screen going black despite the supposedly fresh batteries he'd installed that morning. The device sat uselessly in his hand, a $300 paperweight that had failed him when he needed it most. The temperature plummeted after sunset, dropping from the 90s to near freezing within hours, a characteristic of high desert environments where thin air holds no heat once the sun disappears. Jacob huddled in a shallow depression between lava flows, wrapping himself in the emergency blanket he'd thankfully remembered to pack during his last-minute preparations. Sleep came in fitful intervals, interrupted by the eerie sounds of the desert night, wind whistling through lava tubes like the breathing of some ancient creature, the distant yips of coyotes hunting rabbits in the sagebrush, the skittering of unseen creatures across volcanic rock. When dawn broke, cold and grey, with clouds obscuring the sun, he faced a terrible realization. He was genuinely lost in one of the harshest environments in the continental United States. His water supply was already half gone, and no one knew exactly where he'd entered the wilderness. He'd told his sister Rebecca he was visiting craters of the moon, but he hadn't specified which section, which trail, which remote corner of the vast volcanic landscape had captured his imagination. Jacob spent that second morning trying to retrace his steps, but the volcanic terrain conspired against navigation. Features he thought he recognized turned out to be different formations. The depression where he'd slept looked identical to dozens of others. Without his GPS, and with clouds obscuring the sun, he had no reliable way to maintain a consistent direction. He tried following what seemed like a logical drainage pattern, reasoning that water would collect at lower elevations. But the volcanic landscape didn't follow normal topographic rules. Lava flows had created artificial ridges and blocked natural drainages, producing a maze that defied conventional wilderness navigation techniques. By noon, when the clouds burned off and the heat returned with crushing intensity, Jacob admitted to himself that he was in serious trouble. His remaining water wouldn't last more than 2 days in these conditions. His phone had no signal and was nearly dead anyway, and his carefully planned photography expedition had become a fight for survival. 60 miles away in Idaho Falls, Rebecca Patterson checked her phone for the 20th time that morning, her concern crystallizing into genuine alarm. Her brother Jacob was supposed to have called the previous evening after completing his day hike, a protocol they'd established years ago after a close call Rebecca had experienced in the Rockies. They'd made a pact. Always check in, always leave a detailed itinerary, always respect the worry of those who love you. When noon arrived with still no word and her calls went straight to voicemail, Rebecca's worry transformed into action. She called the Butte County Sheriff's Office, reported her brother missing, provided details about his rental vehicle and general destination, and within hours, Search and Rescue Coordinator Lieutenant Frank Brennan was assembling a response team at the Craters of the Moon Ranger Station. Craters of the Moon is tough country, Brennan explained to Rebecca during their initial phone conversation, his weathered voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of wilderness rescues across Idaho's unforgiving landscapes. The lava fields play hell with search patterns. You can't see into the depressions and caves. Thermal imaging doesn't work worth a damn during the day when the whole landscape is radiating heat, and the terrain absolutely shreds equipment and people. I've had searchers twist ankles, cut themselves on the rock, get heat exhaustion within hours. But we've found people before, Mrs. Patterson, and we'll find your brother. I've worked searches that lasted weeks and ended with bringing someone home alive. The first search teams deployed at first light the next morning, working outward from Jacob's abandoned rental vehicle in carefully coordinated grids designed by experienced search managers who understood the challenges of volcanic terrain. Helicopter overflights proved frustratingly ineffective. The black volcanic rock absorbed radar signals, rendered thermal imaging nearly useless during daylight hours when the entire landscape radiated stored heat and provided such visual uniformity that spotting a person from altitude was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Ground teams moved slowly, painstakingly checking every crevice and lava tube, calling Jacob's name into the wind, marking cleared areas with bright tape. One searcher, a volunteer named David Ortega, who'd driven from Boise to help, twisted his ankle severely on the treacherous terrain and had to be evacuated himself, highlighting the dangers the teams faced in their efforts to find the missing photographer. Back in Denver, Rebecca coordinated with Jacob's few close friends and co-workers, constructing a timeline of his plans based on browser history, recent text messages, and social media posts. He'd researched remote areas of the monument, particularly the wilderness sections beyond the maintained trails where few visitors ventured. He'd been fascinated by photographs of volcanic landscapes, drawn to the stark beauty of desolation, the alien quality of frozen lava fields. He'd posted about wanting to capture images his grandfather would have been proud of, about proving to himself that he could handle genuine wilderness rather than just the curated outdoor experiences he'd been consuming through screens. These details helped narrow the search parameters, but the wilderness area still encompassed tens of thousands of acres of nearly impassable terrain that would take months to thoroughly search with available resources. By his third day lost, Jacob had developed a grim routine built on survival instincts he didn't know he possessed. He rationed his remaining water to just a few sips each hour, though his tongue felt thick and swollen. His lips had cracked and bled, leaving rust-colored stains on his collar. The inside of his mouth tasted metallic, a flavor he'd come to associate with severe dehydration after reading survival accounts during his outdoor research phase. He'd tried following a logical course, always heading in what he believed was west toward the main road, but the landscape conspired against navigation at every turn. Ridges that seemed to lead somewhere simply dead-ended in impassable lava flows, or steep cinder cone slopes that crumbled dangerously underfoot, sending cascades of volcanic gravel down onto the flows below. The heat during midday became genuinely life-threatening, with surface temperatures on the black basalt exceeding 170 degrees, hot enough to cause severe burns through clothing and boots. With no shade anywhere in the volcanic wilderness, Jacob took to sheltering in small lava tubes, collapsed tunnels in ancient flows where molten rock had once rushed through. These subterranean spaces offered at least some relief from the direct sun, though the still air inside was stifling and disorienting. In these dark spaces, he encountered the true inhabitants of this harsh realm, side-blotched lizards with their distinctive coloring, deer mice that scattered at his approach, and once, alarmingly, a great basin rattlesnake coiled in the coolness, its presence announced by the distinctive sound that sent his heart racing. The encounter left him shaking and hyperventilating, but the snake showed no aggression, merely tolerating his presence in the shared refuge from the brutal heat above. Both creatures united in their struggle against the volcanic wasteland's extremes. On the morning of his fourth day, delirious from dehydration and beginning to hallucinate figures in the wavering heat, Jacob stumbled across something that seemed impossible, miraculous. At the bottom of a deep, blowout crater, a volcanic vent where gases had once exploded violently through the cooling lava, he spotted moisture glistening on rock. Not just dampness, but actual standing water pooled in a rocky depression, steam rising from its surface in the cool morning air. His rational mind, still functioning despite his desperation, warned him to be cautious. Water in volcanic areas could be contaminated with dissolved minerals, sulfur compounds, or even toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide or carbon dioxide that collected in low areas. But his body, screaming for hydration, overruled his mind's warnings. He descended carefully into the crater, his movements unsteady and awkward, and as he drew closer through the jumbled basalt blocks, he felt warmth radiating from the pool like heat from a fireplace. It was a hot spring, fed by geothermal water rising from deep underground through cracks and fissures in the ancient lava flows, heated by residual thermal energy from volcanic activity thousands of feet below. The water emerged at roughly 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to scald at first direct contact, but cool enough once collected in bottles and allowed to rest that it might save his life. Jacob filled his bottles with trembling hands and waited, testing the temperature obsessively before taking his first cautious sip. The water tasted strange, mineral-heavy and slightly alkaline with dissolved bicarbonates and silicates, but it didn't make him immediately sick. He drank slowly, fighting every instinct to gulp, knowing from his reading that overwhelming his system could cause severe cramping or worse. The warm water hit his stomach strangely, spreading heat through his core, and for the first time in days, he felt something like hope. The hot spring became his base camp, his salvation, his reason to keep fighting when every logical assessment said he should be dead. The surrounding crater offered protection from the constant wind that scoured the exposed lava fields, and the warm water, when he could bear to submerge himself briefly, provided relief from the frigid desert nights that sent temperatures plummeting into the 30s and covered the landscape with frost by dawn. He discovered through careful experimentation that he could collect the spring water in his bottles, set them at the crater's edge where cooler air circulated and temperatures dropped, and have drinkable water within an hour or two as heat dissipated. His food supplies had run out completely on day 5. The energy bars and trail mix that had seemed so adequate during planning now revealed as woefully insufficient for the calories he was burning. But the water kept him alive, kept his kidneys functioning, staved off the organ failure that claimed most people lost in desert environments within 3 to 4 days without hydration. Jacob lost precise track of time around day 7, though he tried to maintain a count by scratching marks on a flat piece of basalt with a sharper fragment. His journal entries, scratched onto paper from his pack with a stub of pencil, became increasingly erratic and difficult to read. He wrote letters to Rebecca, to his parents who'd retired to Arizona, to friends he'd neglected during his years of self-imposed isolation. He wrote about regrets that seemed crushing in their weight, about realizations that came too late, about how he'd confused isolation with independence and convinced himself that needing others was weakness. He wrote about his grandfather, about conversations they should have had, about lessons he'd understood too late. The volcanic wilderness, indifferent to his suffering, became a mirror reflecting every choice that had led him to this lonely crater at what might be the end of his life. Search efforts continued with dogged persistence, though resources were increasingly strained as days stretched into a week. Lieutenant Brennan expanded the search perimeter based on Rebecca's detailed information about her brother's interests in remote volcanic features and dramatic geological formations. Teams focused on areas with geological significance, prominent cinder cones, rift zones where the Earth had split and erupted, unusual formations that might attract a photographer seeking the perfect shot. Fixed-wing aircraft crisscrossed the wilderness during optimal viewing hours at dawn and dusk, when shadows might reveal human activity or equipment, when the thermal contrast between cooling rock and warm bodies might register on sensors. Ground teams worked in rotating shifts, covering and recovering terrain in overlapping patterns, knowing that in such complex topography, a person could easily be missed just yards from a previous search path, hidden in one of countless depressions or sheltering in lava tubes that honeycombed the flows. Rebecca flew to Idaho on day 9 of Jacob's disappearance, unable to remain passive in Denver while her brother remained lost in the wilderness. She met with the search teams at their command post, looked into the faces of exhausted volunteers and professional rescuers, and saw her own fear and determination reflected back. Lieutenant Brennan was honest with her about the odds, a conversation that took place in a quiet corner of the ranger station as maps and search grids covered every available surface. After this much time, he explained gently but directly, survival became increasingly unlikely, especially given the harsh environment, limited supplies Jacob had carried, and the physical toll of exposure. But he also shared stories of miraculous survivals that defied logic. The hiker found, after 12 days in the Sierra Nevada, the climber who'd lasted 17 days with a broken leg in the Cascades, the child discovered after 4 days in Alaskan wilderness that had seemed certain to claim him. "People are tougher than we give them credit for," Brennan told her as they stood at the command post's overlook, gazing out over the black lava fields that held her brother somewhere in their twisted depths, somewhere in that vast expanse of frozen violence. And this country, hard as it is, has water in places most people don't expect. There are springs scattered throughout this volcanic landscape, fed by aquifers deep underground. If your brother found a source, if he kept his head and remembered his training, if he didn't panic and exhaust himself, there's still hope. I've seen people survive on determination alone, survive situations that should have killed them. We're not giving up, and neither should you. By day 14, Jacob had lost perhaps 30 pounds from his already lean frame, his body cannibalizing muscle mass for energy in the absence of any caloric intake. His clothes hung loosely, his belt cinched to new holes he'd punched with his pocket knife. The hot spring water kept him hydrated, but provided no calories, no nutrients, nothing to sustain the biological furnace that required fuel to continue operating at even minimal capacity. He'd tried eating plant materials from the sparse vegetation around the crater rim, sagebrush leaves that tasted bitter and medicinal, the dried seeds of grasses that grew in protected pockets of soil, even bark from the twisted remnants of long-dead juniper trees. His stomach rejected most of it, cramping violently and forcing him to expel what little he'd managed to consume. He'd caught and eaten several insects, beetles, grasshoppers, even larvae he'd found under rocks, forcing himself to view them as protein rather than contemplating what he was actually consuming, crunching their bodies between his teeth while fighting nausea. His mind played increasingly elaborate tricks as malnutrition and isolation took their toll on his psychological state. He heard helicopters that weren't there, the distinctive thump of rotors that faded when he climbed from the crater to investigate. He saw rescue teams approaching across the lava fields, figures that vanished when he blinked or waved his emergency blanket. Once, in what he later recognized as a complete hallucination, he climbed laboriously out of the crater and spotted what he was absolutely certain was his rental SUV on a distant ridge, exactly where he'd left it. He walked for hours toward it, burning precious energy, only to reach the location and find nothing but more black rock and empty sky. The disappointment of that false hope nearly broke him completely. He sat on the scorching lava and wept, something he hadn't done since childhood, his body producing tears it could barely afford to lose from its depleted reserves. But something stubborn in Jacob Patterson's core refused to surrender to the volcanic wasteland's indifference. Perhaps it was the letters he'd written to Rebecca, the promise implicit in every word that he'd deliver them personally, and apologize for years of taking her concern for granted, for treating her check-ins as obligations rather than expressions of love. Perhaps it was the sunrise on day 15, unexpectedly beautiful as light, painted the volcanic landscape in shades of gold and crimson that his photographer's eye couldn't help but appreciate, even in extremis, even while facing death. Perhaps it was simply the human animal's baseline refusal to stop fighting until the absolute end, the biological imperative that had kept the species alive through ice ages and plagues and countless individual disasters. Perhaps it was his grandfather's voice, remembered from childhood camping trips, saying that giving up was the only unforgivable failure. He established a more rigorous routine that preserved what remained of his sanity and gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together in suffering. Each morning at dawn, he climbed to the highest point of the crater rim and spent an hour scanning the horizon methodically, waving his bright orange emergency blanket in slow, deliberate arcs that any aerial search might spot. Each afternoon during peak heat, he sheltered in the coolest part of the lava tube he'd discovered near the spring, conserving energy and avoiding the worst of the sun's assault. Each evening, he collected spring water in a careful process, treated it by letting it cool in the night air, and drank methodically according to a schedule scratched on his basalt calendar. He exercised gently to maintain muscle function and circulation, doing modified push-ups and squats that his weakened body could barely manage. He talked aloud to himself, conducting imaginary conversations with Rebecca and his parents, reciting poems he'd memorized in high school, song lyrics from his youth, anything to keep his mind engaged and functional rather than spiraling into despair. The hot spring that saved his life also inflicted its own peculiar torment, a price for the survival it offered. The warm water felt wonderful initially when he was shivering from cold nights, but prolonged exposure left his skin wrinkled, irritated, and vulnerable to infection from the countless small cuts and abrasions he'd suffered on the sharp basalt. The minerals in the water, silica, calcium, bicarbonate, trace elements leaching from volcanic rock over millennia, provided some nutritional benefit, but also caused digestive distress that left him cramping and weak. He learned through painful trial and error to drink smaller quantities more frequently, to never consume the water immediately after it emerged from the earth when mineral concentrations were highest, to always let it cool and settle first so particulates dropped to the bottom. These lessons came at the cost of severe cramping, nausea that left him retching, and precious energy expended on misery that further depleted his reserves. On day 17, the search effort received unexpected reinforcement that changed everything. A regional news story about the missing Colorado photographer had gone viral on social media platforms, shared thousands of times with hashtags and appeals for information. Volunteer search teams from across Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana began arriving in Idaho Falls to assist, answering the call that something in human nature produces when someone is lost and suffering. Experienced wilderness trackers, amateur drone operators with sophisticated thermal equipment, retired search and rescue professionals with decades of experience. They came with their own equipment and expertise, paying their own expenses, determined to find Jacob Patterson before it was too late, before another name was added to the list of those the wilderness had claimed. Among these volunteers was Christine Lambert, a 52-year-old wilderness guide from Jackson Hole who specialized in volcanic terrain and had spent years exploring craters of the moon and similar landscapes across the West. She'd written articles about the geology, led scientific expeditions, and developed an almost intuitive understanding of how volcanic landscapes were structured. Something about the search parameters bothered her as she reviewed the maps and previous search patterns at the command post. Everyone's been focusing on the likely routes, the logical paths a lost hiker would take, she explained to Lieutenant Brennan during a late-night strategy session as volunteers slept in tents outside. But this guy's a photographer seeking dramatic shots. He wasn't hiking for exercise or following established trails to scenic overlooks. He was looking for unusual features, dramatic landscapes, the kind of geological formations that don't make sense from a hiking perspective, but would be irresistible to someone with a camera and an eye for composition. We should be checking the weird stuff. The deep craters, the isolated formations, the spots that seem too remote or too difficult, but might offer unique photographic opportunities. Brennan, desperate enough after 17 days to try any reasonable theory, authorized Lambert to lead a small team of experienced volunteers into areas previously deemed too remote or unlikely based on conventional lost person behavior models. On the morning of day 19, her group approached a cluster of blowout craters in the southeastern section of the wilderness area, features created by ancient volcanic gases exploding violently through cooling lava, creating deep depressions rarely visited because they required difficult off-trail navigation. These craters were deep, sheltered from view, and, according to geological surveys Lambert had studied, potentially connected to geothermal water sources from the aquifer deep below the Snake River plain that fed hot springs throughout the region. Lambert positioned herself at the rim of the largest crater, took a deep breath, and called Jacob's name in the distinctive pattern search and rescue professionals use, her voice trained through years of mountain guiding to carry across valleys and canyons. Then she waited in absolute silence, listening with every fiber of her being, filtering out wind and the calls of ravens, focusing on any sound that might be human. Far below, faint as a ghost, filtered through distance and exhaustion, came a response. Not clear words, but definitely a human sound, a hoarse shout, a call, something that didn't belong to wind or wildlife, something that made her heart race with hope and urgency. Jacob heard the voice as if in a dream, filtering through the fog of delirium and malnutrition that had become his constant state. He'd heard so many phantom voices over the previous days that his first instinct was to ignore it, to save his energy and not chase another cruel hallucination that would end in crushing disappointment. But something about this call seemed different, more solid, anchored in the physical world rather than his oxygen-starved imagination. The tone, the deliberate pacing, the professional quality of the call. It registered as real in some deep part of his brain that still functioned correctly. He forced himself to stand, every joint protesting, every muscle trembling with exhaustion, his vision darkening at the edges. He grabbed his orange emergency blanket with hands that shook uncontrollably and climbed toward the crater rim, moving with agonizing slowness up the slope he'd descended and ascended countless times over the past weeks. Each step a monumental effort. When he reached the rim and saw actual human figures silhouetted against the morning sky, when he realized this wasn't another hallucination, Jacob's legs gave out completely. He collapsed on the rough basalt that had been his prison and salvation, waving the blanket weakly, unable to produce more than a croak from his parched throat, despite the water he'd been drinking. The figures moved toward him with purposeful speed, and then Christine Lambert was kneeling beside him, checking his pulse with practiced fingers, speaking in calm, professional tones while her team radioed for immediate helicopter evacuation, calling in coordinates and medical status. "Jacob Patterson?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the description she'd memorized, but needing confirmation, needing to hear him respond. "You've been lost for 19 days. You're going to be okay now. We've got you. The hard part is over." The helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, a medical crew already prepared based on radio reports for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure. They lifted Jacob from the crater that had been simultaneously his prison and his salvation, flying him over the volcanic landscape that had nearly claimed his life, carrying him to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, where advanced trauma care waited. Rebecca was already there, having maintained a vigil at the hospital since arriving in Idaho, refusing to give up hope even as the days stretched into weeks and the odds grew increasingly grim. The reunion happened in the emergency department, Jacob still being assessed by doctors, IVs already feeding fluids and electrolytes into his depleted system, monitors tracking vitals that were weak but stable. Rebecca sat beside the gurney, holding her brother's hand, blistered, sunburned, skeletal, and wept with relief that felt almost painful in its intensity, release of tension she'd carried for nearly 3 weeks. Jacob tried to speak, to deliver the apologies and revelations he'd rehearsed endlessly in his mind, but she stopped him with a gentle pressure on his hand, her tears dropping onto the white hospital sheets. "Later," she said, her voice breaking. "You can tell me everything later. Right now, you just need to heal. That's all that matters. You're alive, and that's all that matters." Jacob spent 8 days in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration, acute malnutrition, exposure, and the cumulative physical trauma of 3 weeks in one of America's harshest environments. His kidneys had been stressed to the point of early failure, filtering the mineral-heavy spring water and concentrating waste products from his body's consumption of its own tissues. His electrolyte levels were dangerously imbalanced. Sodium, potassium, magnesium, all critically low. The hot spring water that saved his life had also introduced unusually high levels of certain minerals into his system. silica deposits in his tissues, elevated calcium that affected his heart rhythm, trace amounts of radon gas that had been dissolved in the geothermal water. But the emergency department doctors and specialists marveled at his survival, calling it remarkable given the circumstances and duration of his ordeal, a testament to human resilience and the luck of finding water where most would have found only death. Lieutenant Brennan visited on day 3 of Jacob's hospitalization, bringing with him Christine Lambert and several members of the search teams who'd spent weeks combing the volcanic wilderness. They wanted to understand exactly what had happened, to learn from Jacob's experience for future rescues, to add details to databases that might save another lost hiker someday. Jacob walked them through his decisions as clearly as his recovering mind could manage. His mistakes that had led to getting lost, his improvisations that had kept him alive. He described the hot spring in detail, its precise location using the GPS coordinates rescuers had recorded, its temperature and mineral content, the surrounding geology that had created this life-saving feature. Brennan made careful notes, already planning to have geologists survey the area and add the spring to official maps and databases. "You did several things right," Brennan told him, his weathered face showing genuine respect. "And honestly, you got lucky in ways most people don't. You stayed in one place once you found water, instead of exhausting yourself wandering aimlessly, which is what kills most lost hikers. You rationed what you had and developed routines that kept you mentally functional when isolation could have driven you into fatal mistakes. And you never gave up, even when giving up would have been so much easier, even when every logical assessment said you were going to die out there. That determination, that refusal to surrender, that's what really saved you." Christine Lambert was particularly interested in the geothermal water source, asking detailed questions about the spring's characteristics, the crater's structure, the surrounding geology. "That hot spring isn't marked on any current maps," she explained, excitement evident in her voice. "The volcanic landscape is constantly shifting in subtle ways over decades and centuries. Old springs close as mineral deposits seal their conduits. New ones open as earthquakes create fresh fractures, lava tubes collapse and expose features that were hidden underground. You found something special, Jacob, something that literally saved your life by pure chance. If you'd taken shelter in any of the dozens of other craters in that area, you would have died of dehydration within a week. That's how close it was." The story of Jacob Patterson's survival and rescue became national news within days, featured in outdoor magazines, survival documentaries, and news programs, fascinated by human interest stories with happy endings. People were captivated by the details, the volcanic wasteland that seemed more Mars than Earth, the unmarked hot spring that provided water against all odds, the 19 days of isolation that tested the limits of human endurance, the volunteer searchers who refused to give up when the odds suggested Jacob was already dead. But Jacob himself struggled with the attention, uncomfortable with being portrayed as some kind of survival hero when the truth was more complex and humbling. What he'd experienced wasn't adventure or excitement, it was sustained terror, physical agony, and the overwhelming realization of how unprepared he'd been for the wilderness he'd entered so casually, how many mistakes he'd made, how many times he'd nearly given up. 6 months after his rescue, after physical therapy had restored most of his strength and counseling had helped him process the psychological trauma, Jacob returned to Craters of the Moon. He came with proper permits, experienced guides including Christine Lambert and Rebecca by his side, refusing to let him face the volcanic landscape alone. They hiked carefully to the blowout crater where he'd survived, now marked on updated geological surveys and maps as Patterson Spring, in recognition of its role in one of the region's most dramatic survival stories. The hot spring still bubbled from the volcanic rock, steam rising in the cool autumn morning air, a miracle of geology and hydrology that had sustained one desperate man through impossible circumstances. Standing at the crater rim, looking down at the pool that had kept him alive, Jacob felt an overwhelming rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Gratitude for the random convergence of geological forces, volcanic eruptions 15,000 years ago, fractures in ancient lava, an aquifer heated by residual thermal energy deep underground, that had placed water in this specific location at precisely the time he needed it. Gratitude for Christine Lambert's insight and intuition, for the hundreds of searchers who'd spent weeks looking for him when conventional wisdom suggested he was already dead. Gratitude for Rebecca's unwavering faith that he could be found, her refusal to accept the growing consensus that they were now conducting a recovery mission rather than a rescue. Gratitude for the human body's stubborn resilience, its refusal to surrender, even when logic suggested survival was impossible. He'd spent his recovery time rebuilding more than just his physical health and damaged body. He'd reconnected with friends he'd neglected during years of self-imposed isolation, had honest conversations about depression and mental health with a therapist who specialized in trauma. He'd begun working with search and rescue organizations, teaching wilderness safety seminars about preparation, communication, and the difference between confident exploration and dangerous arrogance. The photographs he'd been so desperate to capture during that ill-fated trip seemed trivial now compared to the relationships and connections he'd nearly lost forever, the years he'd wasted pursuing images instead of experiences. His grandfather had loved the wilderness not for its photogenic qualities, but for what it taught about humility, preparedness, and the thin line between confidence and hubris that could mean the difference between life and death. Rebecca stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her presence an anchor keeping him grounded in the present rather than trapped in memories of suffering. "You scared me," she said quietly, her voice carrying weight they both understood. "Worst weeks of my life, thinking I'd lost you out here." "I know," Jacob replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry for what I put you through, for the years of taking you for granted, for treating your concern as obligation rather than love. But I learned something out here, trapped in this crater, dying slowly while the world continued without me. I learned that survival isn't about being tough or self-sufficient or independent like some movie hero. It's about being part of something larger, family, community, the random kindness of volunteers who search for strangers, the geological processes that put water where it needs to be. I was never really alone, even when I thought I was, even in my darkest moments. You were always there, the search teams were always looking, and the earth itself provided what I needed. That connection, that interdependence, that's what survival actually means." They descended into the crater together, and Jacob filled a bottle with water from Patterson's spring, sealing it carefully and reverently. Back at the trailhead hours later, exhausted but satisfied, he donated it to the Craters of the Moon Visitor Center, where it would be displayed alongside his story, a testament to survival, to hope, and to the countless people who refused to give up on the lost. The volcanic wasteland that had nearly claimed his life had instead taught him its greatest lesson, that human connection is the resource no one can survive without, more essential than water, more life-sustaining than warmth, the true spring from which all survival flows, the force that brings people home against impossible odds.